Men like him weren't murderers after all. They sometimes took their own lives, and they weren't murdered, especially by psychotic fans. That was pulp fiction. There was John Lennon, of course, but he moved to his saddlebag, catching a whiff of the cop as he went by. For one moment, Johnny had a brilliant but unfocused memory of a drunken, abusive, crazily funny father who had always seemed to smell exactly as this cop did now. Old Spice on top, sweat underneath the aftershave, plain old black-eyed meanness for everything, like the dirt floor in an old cellar. Both of the saddlebags were undone. Johnny raised the fringed top, aware that he could still smell sweat and old. The cop was standing right at the shoulder. Johnny reached for the hanging arm of the poncho, stopped as he saw what was lying on top of his pile of AAA maps. Part of him was shocked, but most of him wasn't surprised. He looked at the cop. The cop was looking at the saddlebag. "Oh, Johnny," he said regretfully. "This is disappointing. This is très disappointing." He reached in and picked up the gallon-sized baggie lying on the pile of maps. Johnny didn't have to sniff to know that the stuff inside wasn't cherry blend. Stuck on the front of the baggie, like someone's idea of a joke, the round yellow smiley stick. "That's not mine," Johnny Marinville said. His voice sounded tired and distant, like the message on the very old phone answering. "That's not mine, and you know it, don't you? You put it there." "Yeah, blame the cops," the big man said. "Just like in your liberal books, right? Man, I smelled the dope the second you got close. Reek of it." "Look," Johnny began. "Get in the car, Pinko. Get in the car, fag." The voice indignant, the gray eyes full of laughter. Joke, Johnny thought. Some kind of crazy practical joke. Then from somewhere off in the west, more howls rose. Angle of them this time. Pop's eyes rolled in that direction. He grinned. Johnny felt a scream rising in his throat. He had to press his lips together to keep it in. There was no joke in the big cop's expression as he looked toward that sound. It was the look of a man who was totally insane. Jesus, he was so fucked. "My children of the desert," the cop said. "Antoy, what music they..." He laughed, looked down at the baggie of dope in his big hand, shook his head, and laughed even harder. Johnny stood watching him. His assurance, a man like him was never murdered, suddenly gone. "Travels with Harley," the cop said. "You know what a stupid name for a book that is? What a stupid concept. And to plunder the literary legacy of Steinbeck, a writer whose shoes you weren't fit to lick. That makes me mad." Before Johnny knew it, what was happening, the silver flare of pain went off in his head. He was aware of staggering backward with hands clapped over his face and hot blood gushing through, of flailing his arms, of thinking, "I'm all right, not gonna fall over, I'm all right." And then he was laying on his side in the road, screaming up at the blue socket of the sky. The nose under his fingers no longer felt it straight. It seemed to be lying against his cheek. He had a deviated septum from all the coke he had done in the 80s. He remembered his doctor telling him he ought to get that fixed, or he ran into a sign or a swinging door or something, and it just exploded. It Well, it hadn't been a door or a sign, and it hadn't exactly exploded, but it had certainly undergone a shift and radical change. He thought these things in what seemed perfect, perfectly coherent fashion, even while his mouth went on screaming. "In fact, it makes me furious," the cop said, and kicked him high up on the left thigh. Pain came in a sheet that sank in like acid and turned the big muscles in his leg to stone. Johnny rolled back and forth, now clutching his leg instead of his nose, scraping his cheek against the asphalt of Highway 50, screaming, gasping, pulling sand down his throat, and coughing it harshly back out when he tried to scream again. The truth is, it makes me sick with rage, and kicked Johnny's ass, high up toward the small of his back. Now the pain was too enormous to be borne. Surely he would pass out. But he didn't. He only writhed and crawdaddy, broken white line. Morning, how are you? Johnny's getting beat up. Screaming and bleeding from his broken nose and coughing out sand, while in the distance coyotes howled, thickening shadows stretching out from the distant mountain. Get up, the cop said. On your feet, Lord Jim. If you want to know where we're at, we are in chapter 3, section 4. In my book, it's page 96, but I have a big book, um, big writing. So we are almost on 5, honestly. Got one page to section 5. I can't, Johnny Marinville sobbed, pulling his legs up to his chest, crossing his arms over his belly, his defensive posture dimly remembered from the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and from even before that, from a lecture he had attended in Philadelphia prior to the first freedom rides down into Mississippi. He had meant to go along on one of those. Not only was it a great cause, it was the stuff of which great fiction was made. But in the end, something else had come up, probably his cock, at the sight of a raised skirt. On your feet, you piece of shit. You're in my house now. The house of the wolf and the scorpion. You better not forget it. That makes... I can't. You broke my leg. Jesus Christ, you hurt me so bad. Your leg's not broken. You don't know what being hurt is yet. Now get up. I can't. I really... The gunshot was deafening. Ricochet of the slug off the road, a monstrous wasp. And Johnny was on his feet even before he was 100% sure he wasn't dead. He stood on one foot in the eastbound lane. On the westbound, trunk swaying back and forth, the lower half of his face covered with blood. Sand was stuck in it, making little curls and commas on his lips and cheeks and chin. Hey, big shot. You wet your pants, the cop said. Johnny looked down and saw he had. No matter how much you jump and dance, he thought. His left thigh throbbed like an infected tooth. His ass was still, mostly numb, felt like a frozen slab of meat. He supposed he should be grateful, all things considered. If the cop had kicked him a little higher that second time, he might have paralyzed him. You're a sorry excuse for a writer. You're a sorry excuse for a man, the cop said. He was holding a huge revolver in one hand. He looked down at the baggie of pot, which he still held in the other, and shook his head disgustingly. I know that not just by what you say, but by the mouth you say it out of. In fact, if I looked at your loose-lipped and self-indulgent mouth for too long at a stretch, I'd kill you right here. I wouldn't be able to help myself. Coyotes howled in the distance. Woo, 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 like something that belonged in the soundtrack of a old John Wayne movie. You did, though, Johnny said in a foggy, stuffy voice. Not yet, the cop said and smiled. But the nose is a start. It actually improves your looks. Not much, but a little. He opened the back door of his cruiser. And as he did, Johnny wondered how long this little comedy had taken. He had absolutely no idea. But not one car or truck had passed well. Not one. Get in, big shot. Where you where are you taking me? Where you think I'd take a self-indulgent pinko pothead asshole like you? The old calabazoo. Calabazoo. Now get in the car. Johnny got in the car, and as he did, he touched the right breast pocket of his motorcycle. Cell phone. Part 5. He couldn't sit on his bottom. It hurt too much. So he leaned over on his right thigh, one hand cupped loosely over his throbbing nose. It felt like something alive and malevolent, something that was sinking deep, poisonous stingers into his flesh. But for the time being, he was able to ignore it. Let the cellular work, he prayed, speaking to a god he had made fun of for most of his creative life. Most recently in a story called Heaven Sent Weather, which had been published in Harper's Magazine. Generally favorable comment. Please let the damn phone work. God, and please let have his ears on. Then, realizing all of that was getting the cart quite a bit ahead of the horse, he added a third request. Please give me a chance to use the phone in the first place, okay? As if in answer to this first part of his prayer, Big Cop passed the driver's door of his cruiser without even looking at it and walked to Johnny's motorcycle, put Johnny's helmet on his own head, and swung one leg over the seat. He was very tall, so it was actually more of a step than a swing, and a moment later the Harley's engine exploded into life. The cop stood astrode the seat, unbuckled helmet straps hanging, seeming to dwarf the Harley with his own less lovely bulk. He twisted the throttle 4 or 5 times, gunning the motor as if he liked the sound. Then he rocketed the Harley upright, kicked back the center stand, and towed the gear shift down into first, moving cautiously to start with, reminding Johnny a little of himself when he had taken the bike out of storage and ridden it into traffic for the first time. The cop descended the side of the road, used the handbrake, and paddled along with his watching intently for hazards and obstacles. Once he was on the desert floor, he accelerated, changing rapidly up through the gears and weaving around clumps of sagebrush. Run into a gopher hole, Johnny thought, sniffing gingerly through his plugged and throbbing nose. Hit something hard, crash and burn. Don't waste your time on him, he mumbled, and used his thumb to pop the snap over the right breast pocket of his jacket. He took out the Motorola cellular phone. Cellular had been Bill Harris's idea. Maybe the only good idea his agent had had in the last 4 years, and flipped it open. He stared down at the display, breath held, now praying for the S 2 bars. Come on, God, please, he thought. Sweat trickling down his cheeks, blood still leaking out of his swollen, bleeding nose. Got to be an S and 2 bars, anything less, and I might as well use this thing for a suppository. Piece is missing still. Oh, I know what it is. Cross at the bottom of the missing, and then the rest of the top is missing. That would be Nick's rosary. Bet you these are the pieces I was missing before and had to replace. Those are both bells. Wait, which one is it? Oh, no. That would be yours. Yeah. But the boys had, there was Chunky Monkey, which I had, Chocolate Chip, which Tristan had, Chocolate Fudge Brownie, which Nick had, and Half Baked, which I had. So the American Dream is yours. What is in that anyway? I'm going to have to try it sometime. All right, I'm going to keep reading. Might as well use the thing for a suppository. Phone beeped. What came up in the window on the left side of the display was an S, which stood for service, and one bar. Just one? He moaned. Please don't do this to me. Just one more, please. He shook the phone in frustration and saw he had neglected to pull up the antenna. He did, and the second bar appeared above the first. It flickered, went out, then reappeared. Still flickering, but there. Yes, Johnny whispered. Yes. He jerked his head up and stared out the window. His sweat-circled eyes peered through the tangle of long gray hair. There was blood in it now, like the eyes of some haunted animal peering out of its hole. The cop had brought the Softail to a stop about 300 yards out in the scree. He stepped off and then stepped away, letting the bike fall over. The engine died. Even in this situation, Johnny felt a twinge of outrage. The Harley had brought him all the way across the country without a single missed stroke of its sweet American engine, and it hurt to see it treated with such absent disdain. Crazy shit, he whispered. He snuffled back half congealed blood, spat a jellied wad of it onto the cruiser's paper-littered floor, and looked down at the telephone again. On the row of buttons at the bottom, second for the 8 from the right, was one which read Name Menu. Steve had programmed this function for him just before he had set out. Johnny punched the button, and his agent's first name appeared in the window, Bill. Pushed it again, and Terry appeared. Pushed it again, and Jack appeared. Jack Appleton, his editor from FS&G. Dear God, why had he put all these people ahead of Steve Ames? Steve was his lifeline. Down on the desert floor, 300 yards away, the insane cop had taken off the helmet and was kicking sand over Johnny's 86 Harley drag. At this distance, he looked like a kid pulling a tantrum. That was fine. He intended to cover the whole thing. Johnny would have plenty of time to make his call. If the phone cooperated, that was. Chrome light was flashing, and that was a good sign. The second transmission bar was still flickering. Come on, Johnny said to the cellular phone in his shaky, blood-grimy hands. Please, sweetheart, okay? Please. He punched the name menu button again, and Steve appeared. He dropped his thumb onto the send button and squeezed. Then he held the phone to his ear, bending over even further to the right, appearing out of the bottom of the window. As he did so, the cop was still kicking sand over the Harley's engine block. The phone began to ring in Johnny's ear, but he knew he wasn't home free yet. He had tapped into the roamer network. That was all. He was still a step away from Steve Ames, a long step. Come on! A drop of sweat ran into his eye. He used a knuckle to wipe it away. The phone stopped ringing. There was a click. Welcome to Western Roaming Network, a cheery robot voice said. Your call is being routed. Thank you for your patience. Have a nice day. Never mind the 70s shit. Just hurry the fuck up, Johnny whispered. Silence from the phone. In the desert, the cop stepped back from the bike, looking as if trying to decide if he had done enough in the way of camouflage. In the dirty, paper-choked back seat of the cruiser, Johnny Marinville began to cry. Couldn't help it. In a bizarre way, it was like wetting his pants again, only upside down. No, he whispered. No, not yet. You're not done yet. Not with the wind blowing like it is. You better do a little more. Please do a little more. The cop stood there looking down at the bike. His shadow now seemed to stretch out across half a mile of desert, and Johnny peered at him through the bottom of the window, with his clotted hair in his eyes, and the phone mashed against his right ear. He let out a long, shaky sigh of relief as the cop stepped forward and began to stand again, this time spraying it over the Harley. In his ear, the telephone began to ring, and this time the sound was scratchy and distant. If the signal was going through, the quality of the rings seemed to indicate that it was. Another Motorola telephone. This one on the dashboard of a Ryder truck somewhere between 50 and 250 miles east of John Edward Marinville's current position, now ringing. Down in the desert, the cop went on kicking, burying the handlebars of Johnny's scooter. 2 rings, 3 rings, 4. He had one more, 2 at the most, before another robot voice came on the line and told him that the customer he was calling was either out of range or had left the vehicle. Johnny, still crying, closed his eyes. In the throbbing, red-tinged darkness behind the lids, he saw the Ryder truck parked in front of a roadside gas station general store just west of Utah Nevada state line. He was inside buying a pack of his damned cigars and goofing with the counter girl. While outside on the rider's dashboard, the cellular phone, Steve's half of the comm link on his agent insisted upon, rang in the empty cab. 5 rings. And then distant, almost lost in static, but sounding like a voice of an angel, bent down from heaven all the same. He heard Steve's flat West Texas drawl. Hello? You? Boss? The east semi blew by outside. An eastbound semi blew by outside, rocking the cruiser in its backlash. Johnny barely noticed, made no attempt to flag the driver. Probably wouldn't have done enough. His attention hadn't been focused on the telephone. He probably wouldn't have done it even if he hadn't had his phone. Probably wouldn't have done even if his attention hadn't been focused on the telephone in Steve's tenuous voice. The rig was doing 70 at least. The hell was the driver going to see in these 2 tenths of a second it would give him to pass the parked cruiser, especially through the thick dust matted on the windows? He drew in breath through his nose and hawked back blood, ignoring the pain, wanting to clear his voice as much as he could. Steve, I'm in trouble. I'm in bad trouble. There was a heavy crackle of static in his ear, and he was sure he'd lost Steve. But then it cleared. But then when it cleared, he heard, "Up, boss, say again." "Steve, it's Johnny. Do you hear me?" "Hear you." "What's—" Another crackle. It almost completely buried the next word. Johnny thought been it might have been trouble. "I hear you. What's the trouble?" God, let that not just be wishful thinking. The cop had stopped kicking sand again. He stepped away for another critical look at his handiwork, then turned and began to plod back toward the road, head down, hat rim shade in his face, hands plunged in his pockets, and then, with a tense and mounting horror, Johnny realized he had no idea what to tell Steve. All his attention had been focused on making the call, ramming it through by sheer willpower, if that was what it took. Now what? He had no clear idea of where he was, only that, "I'm west of Eli on Highway 50, he said. More sweat ran into his eyes, stinging. "I'm not sure how far west. 40 miles, probably, at least, probably more. There's an RV pulled off the road a little further up from me. There's a cop. Not a state cop, a townie, I think. But I don't know which town. I didn't see it on the door. I don't even know his name." He was talking faster and faster as the cop got closer and closer. Soon he would be babbling. "Take it easy. He's still 100 yards away. You've got plenty of time. For the love of God, just do what comes natural. Do what they pay you for. Do what they've been doing all your life. Communicate, for Christ's sake." But he had never had to do it for his life. Take money, be known in the right circles, to occasionally raise his voice in the roar of the brave old lion. Yes, all those things, but never for his literal life. And if the cop looked up out of his head down plod and saw him, he was crouched down and the phone's antenna was sticking up, of course. It had to be sticking up. "He took my bike, Steve. He took my bike and drove it out into the desert, covered it up with sand. But the way the wind's blowing, it's out in the desert a mile or so east of the RV I told you about and north of the road. Might see if the sun's still up. Followed. Call the cops, the state cops. Tell them I've been grabbed by a cop who's blonde and huge. I mean, this guy's a fucking giant. Have you got that? Nothing from the phone, but windy silence with the occasional burst of static knifing through it. Steve, are you there? No, he wasn't. There was only one transmission bar showing in the phone's display window now, and no one was there. He had lost the connection, and he'd been concentrating so hard on what he was saying that he had no idea when it had happened or how much Steve might have heard. Johnny, are you sure you got through to him at all? That was Terry's voice. Voice sometimes loved. Now he hated it. Hated it worse than any voice he had ever heard in his life. Hated it even worse for the sympathy he heard in it. Are you sure you didn't just imagine the whole? No, he was there. He was there. Son of a bitch was there, Johnny said. He heard pleading quality in his voice. Hated that too. He was, you bitch, for this few seconds at least. Now the cop was only 50 yards away. Johnny shoved the antenna down with the heel of his hand, flipping the mouthpiece closed, and tried to drop the phone back in his right pocket. Lap closed, the phone fell into his lap and bounced onto the floor. He felt around frantically for it, the first finding nothing, crumpled papers, dare anti-drug handouts for the most part, hamburger wrappers coated with ancient grease. His fingers closed on something narrow. Not what he wanted, but even the brief chance he gave it before tossing it away chilled him. It was a little girl's plastic beret. Never mind it. You've got no time to think about what a kid might have been doing in the back of his car. Find your damn phone. Oh, he must almost be here. Yes, almost. He could hear the crunch scuffle of the big cop's boots even over the wind, which had now grown strong enough to rock the cruiser on its springs when gusted. Johnny's hand found a nest of styrofoam coffee cups, and amid them his phone. He seized it, dropped it in his jacket pocket, and pushed the snap closed. When he sat up again, the cop was coming around the front of the car, bent over at the waist so he could peer through the windshield. His face was more sunburned than ever, almost blistered in places. In fact, his lower lip actually was blistered, Johnny saw, and there was another blistery spot on his right temple. Good. That doesn't cross my eyes in the slightest. The cop opened the driver's side door, leaned in, and stared through the mesh between the front seat and the back. His nostrils flared as he sniffed. Johnny, each one of them looked roughly the size of a bowling alley. Puke in the back of my cruiser, Lord Jim? Because if you did, the first thing you're going to get when we hit town is a big old spoon. No, Johnny said. He could feel fresh blood trickling down his throat, and his voice was fogging up again. A dry heave, but I didn't puke. He was actually relieved by what the cop had said. The first thing you're going to get when we indicated that he didn't intend to drag him out of the car, blow his brains out, and bury him next to his suit. Unless he's trying to lull me, soothe me down, make it easier for him to do. Well, whatever. Scared? The cop inquired, still leaning in and looking through the mesh. Tell me the truth, Lord Jimmy. I'll know it'd lie. Fuck. Of course I'm scared. Of course. Came out, of course, as if he had bad cold. Good. He dropped behind the wheel, took off his hat, looked at it. Doesn't fit, he said. Folk singing bitch ruined that one that did. Never sang leaving on a fucking jet plane either. Too bad, Johnny said, not having the slightest idea what the cop was talking about. Lips which lie are best kept silent, the cop said, tossing the hat that wasn't his over into the passenger seat. It landed on a tangle of meshy stuff that appeared studded with spikes. Feet bowed into the tired curve by the cop's weight. settled against Johnny's left knee, squeezed. Sit up, Johnny yelled. Crushing my leg. Sit up and let me pull it out. Jesus, you're killing me. The cop made no reply, and the pressure on Johnny's already outraged left leg increased. He seized it in both hands and tore it free of the sagging seat back with an indrawn hiss of effort that pulled blood down his throat, started him dry heaving for real. Bastard, Johnny yelled. The word popping out in the red misted cough spasm before he could pull it back. The cop seemed not to notice that either. He sat with his head lowered and his fingers tapping lightly on the wheel. His breath was wheezing in his throat, and for a moment Johnny wondered if the man was mocking him. He didn't think so. I hope it's asthma, he thought, and I hope you choke on it. Listen, he said, allowing none of that sentiment to enter his voice. I need something for my nose. Killing me. Even an aspirin. Do you have an aspirin? Pop said nothing. Went on tapping the wheel with his head down. That was all. Johnny opened his mouth to say something else, then closed it again. He was in terrible pain, all right. The worst he could remember, even worse than the gallstone he had passed in '89. But he still didn't want to die. Something in the cop's posture, as if he was very far away in his own head, deciding something important, suggested that death might be close. So he kept silent and waited. Time spun out. The shadows of the mountains grew a bit thicker and moved a bit closer. Coyotes had fallen silent. Pop sat his, with his head lowered and his fingers tapping the sides of the wheel, seeming to meditate, not looking up when another semi went by, heated, headed east, and a car passed them going west, swinging out to give the parked police cruiser with the ticking roof flashers wide berth. Then he picked up something which had been laying beside him on the front seat, an old-fashioned shotgun, the double trigger setup. The cop looked at it fixedly. I guess that woman wasn't really a folk singer, he said, but she tried her best to kill me. No doubt about that. This. Johnny said nothing. His heart was beating slowly and very hard in his chest. You have never written a truly spiritual novel, the cop told him. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word with care. It is your great, unrecognized failing, and it is at the center of your petulant, self-indulgent behavior. You have no interest in you have no interest in your spiritual nature. You mock the God who created you. By doing so, you mortify your own pneuma and glorify the mud which is your sorrow. Do you understand me? Johnny opened his mouth and closed it again. To speak or not to speak, that was a question. The cop solved the dilemma for him, without looking up from the wheel, without so much as a glance into the rearview mirror. He placed the double barrels of the shotgun on his right shoulder, pointed them back through the wire mesh. Johnny moved instinctively, sliding to the left, trying to get away from the huge dark holes. And although the cop still did not look up, the muzzles of the gun tracked him as precisely as a radar-controlled servo motor. He might have a mirror in his lap, Johnny thought, and then, but what good would that do? Wouldn't see anything but the roof of the fucking car. What the hell is going on here? Answer me, the cop said. His voice was dark and brooding. His head was still bent. The hand not holding the shotgun continued to tap the wheel. Another gust of wind, driving sand and alkali dust against the windows in a fine spray. Answer me now. I won't wait. I don't have to wait. There's always another one coming. So, do you understand what I just told you? Yes, said in a trembling voice. Pneuma is the old Gnostic word for spirit. Sarx is body. You said, correct me if just not with the shotgun. Please don't correct me with the shotgun. That I've ignored my spirit in favor of my body. And you could be right. Could very well be. moved to the right again. Shotgun muzzle tracked his movements precisely. Although he could swear that the springs of the back seat made no sound beneath him, and the cop could not see him unless he was using a television monitor or something. Don't toady to me, the cop said wearily. This will only make your fate worse. His lips. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Sarks is not the body. Soma is the body. Sarks is the flesh of the body. Body is made of flesh, as the word was reputedly made flesh by the birth of Jesus Christ. But the body is more than the flesh that makes it. The sum is greater than the parts. Is that so hard for an intellectual such as yourself to understand? Shotgun barrel moving, acting like auto gyro. I I never thought of it that way. Oh, please. Even a spiritual knave like you must understand that a chicken dinner is not a chicken pneuma, soma, and his voice had thickened and now he was hitching in breath, trying to talk as a person does only when trying to finish his thought before the sneeze arrives. He abruptly dropped the shotgun onto the seat again, gasped in a deep breath. The abused seat creaked backward, almost pinning Johnny's left knee again, and let fly. What came out of his mouth and nose, not mucus, but blood, red filmy stuff that looked like nylon mesh. This stuff, raw tissue from the big cop's throat and sinuses, hit the windshield, the steering wheel, and the dashboard. The smell was awful. The smell of rotted meat. Johnny clapped his hands to his face and screamed. There was no way not to scream. He could feel his eyeballs pulsing in their sockets. He could feel adrenaline roar into his systems as the shock reaction set in. Gosh, there's nothing worse than a summer cold, is there? The cop asked in his dark, musing voice. He cleared his throat and spat a clod the size of a crab apple onto the face of the dashboard. That's huge. It hung where it was for a moment, then oozed down the front of the police radio like an unspeakable snail, leaving a trail of blood behind. It hung briefly from the bottom of the radio, then dropped to the floor mat with a plop. Johnny closed his eyes, behind his hands, and moaned. That was Sarks, Pop said. Started the engine. You might want to keep that in mind, I'd say, for your next book, but I don't think you're going to be. I don't think there's going to be a next book, do you, Mr. Marinville? Johnny didn't answer, only kept his hands over his face and his eyes closed. It occurred to him that quite possibly none of this was happening, that he was in a nut house someplace, having the world's ugliest hallucination. But his better, deeper mind knew that wasn't true. The stench of what the man had sneezed out. He's dying. He's got to be dying. That's infection and internal bleeding. He's sick. Mental illness is only one symptom of something else. Some radiation thing. Maybe rabies or the cop hauled the Caprice cruiser around in a U, pointing it east. Johnny kept his hands over his face a little longer, trying to get himself under, then lowered them and opened his eyes. What he saw out the right-hand window made his jaw drop. Coyotes sat along the roadside at 50-foot intervals like an honor guard, silent, yellow-eyed, tongues lolling. They appeared to be grinning. He turned and looked out the other window, and there were more of them, sitting in the dust, the blazing sun of late afternoon, watching the police cruiser go by. Is that a symptom too? He asked himself. What you're seeing out there, is that a symptom too? If so, how come I can see it? He looked out the cruiser's back window, the coyotes peeling away as soon as they passed. He saw and lopping off into the desert. You'll learn, Lord Jim, the cop said, and Jim turned back toward him. He saw gray eyes staring from the rearview mirror. One was filmed with blood. Before your time is up, I think you'll understand a great deal more than you do now. Ahead was a sign by the side of the road, an arrow pointing the way toward some little town or other. The cop put on his turn blinker, although there was no one to see it. I'm taking you to the classroom, the big cop said. School will be in shortly. He made a right turn, cruiser lifting onto two wheels, and then settling back. It headed south toward the crackled bulwark of the open pit mine, and the town hurtled at its base. We are on chapter 4, and I need to get something to eat. So we're going to pause. Stop for now. It hasn't been an hour. But we're starting chapter 4 next time we start. I'm going to stop there because I got to get some salad, but still, my belly's telling. Y'all are some wonderful people, I tell you. Love having you by. Knowing that you guys will sit and listen. Very much appreciated. Desperation is getting quite interesting. So, we have the Carvers, the Jacksons, one dead, and another guy. So, now we have Johnny. I'm wondering if the other guy in the cell might be the names. Why he didn't answer the phone. So we'll find out as we go along. Because I can't remember reading if it was or not. I'll have to actually look back through the pages, like whether or not when they were talking about everybody that was inside. They got back to the if it was because there was a in there already. So now quite interesting. Whole chapter I do believe. Yeah. Back. I can look back real quick and see that a lot of people yelling at her. Grab the gun. Or sure if they know Carvers are in one cell. Dad or the child, the Mary obviously is now locked up. And then there's another man. Don't know. They actually said where they've said it. So hopefully we'll know for sure. Reading as Johnny gets, as we know, Johnny's probably going to the jail cell as well. So, and we're gonna hopefully find out who Talk is. So that'll be interesting. So this will be great. We'll start chapter 4 later today, probably. I have some things I need to get done after I get something in my belly. So we will see what we can do. But I very much appreciate you guys. Even if you go do other stuff, and listen, I love it. I love being able to be here. And sometimes I play games, but I've been wanting to read lately. Kind of fun. I will be taking the videos and putting them into highlights so that they're permanently there. And that way I can leave them there for people to listen to. Running Man is up, different parts. There's a couple there for Famix. Very hyper and interesting. And then what I'm gonna do is I think I'm gonna wait till Desperation's done and I'm gonna upload them to YouTube. Quite sure yet, but I am. YouTube's got the Running Man on it. So I will talk to you guys later. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Follow if you'd like. I love you guys. Thank you. Okay.